Welcome to the Law School Toolbox podcast. Today we are doing another installment of the Law School Toolbox book club, and we're talking about Mindsight by Dan Siegel. Your Law School Toolbox hosts are Alison Monahan and Lee Burgess. That's me. We're here to demystify the law school and early legal career experience so you'll be the best law student and lawyer you can be. We're the co-creators of the Law School Toolbox, Bar Exam Toolbox, and the career-related website Career Dicta. Alison also runs the Girls Guide to Law School. If you enjoy the show, please leave a review or rating on your favorite listening app. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us. You can reach us via the contact form on lawschooltoolbox.com, and we'd love to hear from you. And with that, let's get started.
Welcome back to the Law School Toolbox podcast. Today we're finally talking about Mindset, the book we started reading for the book club quite some time ago, which admittedly was my fault for not finishing it quickly.
That's true. You did finish it.
It's a dense book. You've got to sit with it.
You do.
It is written by Dan Siegel, who, at least at the time that he wrote this book, was a clinical professor of psychology at the UCLA School of Medicine and co-director of the UCLA Mindful Awareness Research Center. And the subtitle, which is kind of a big promise, is The New Science of Personal Transformation. So, Lee, why do you think this is relevant for law students?
Oh, but before we do that, can I talk about how much I love Dan Siegel?
Sure.
So we read this book because I started to nerd out on Dan Siegel's work as a parent, because he is a pediatric psychiatrist and has written some really fabulous books on parenting. Three, I think the first one I read was The Whole Brain Child. I've also read his next book called No Drama Discipline. He's also written a book called Parenting from the Inside Out. All of these are fabulous and really insightful in how the brain works. And then I learned about the fact that he had written books for adults too. And then I was like, Alison, we have to go read these books. And then we saw him speak at Wisdom 2.0, which was a conference we went to back in March in San Francisco, where he talked about some of his new work, which was about quantum physics, which...
It was very impressive in the moment. Now I have no idea what he was actually talking about, but...
But he's a very fascinating guy and has done a lot of really interesting work and has his own fascinating story, I think, about his journey to become a medical doctor, his disillusion with kind of the medical profession and how they were treating patients, things that felt somewhat familiar with about the legal profession. But I think that the way he talks and speaks about things, about how we work and the power we have over our own minds, is pretty revolutionary. So I totally geek out. I mean, I saw him talk after Wisdom again.
You're basically a groupie.
I'm totally a groupie, and I really nerd out about it. So I just had to take this nerdiness and apply it to the law student scenario.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I find most interesting is that lawyers in training, that we're taught to be really logical, very left brain. Mm-hmm. A lot of the book is about kind of the physiology of the brain, and it does have this left brain, right brain thing, and sometimes those are integrated and sometimes they're not. I think he had a really great model of the brain. I'm not going to try to explain it, but, using his hand and the kind of the different pieces of it and the sides of it, it actually made sense to me in a way that most of the stuff doesn't really. So, we're taught to really be very logical and left-brained in the law, but that doesn't mean that we're not taking in and processing other types of information. Mm-hmm. We're just doing it, in this case, outside of our conscious or even some ways subconscious awareness. But then that information kind of comes out in weird ways, so you get meltdowns or shutting down for reasons you're not really fully aware of when something happens.
Alcoholism, substance abuse.
Yeah, substance abuse, all sorts of depression, anxiety.
Self-sabotaging behavior.
Exactly. All of this stuff. And Will Meyerhofer, who's a lawyer turned therapist, talks about the self-sabotage stuff a lot. People working in firms and then they'll come home and they just have a couple of hours and they should be having dinner and going to bed or whatever. And they'll play video games for 7 hours. And he's like, why are you doing that? Because you're self-sabotaging. Right. There's something going on that you're not recognizing. And then, you have these compulsions basically to destroy your life because you hate working at the firm.
Yep.
So I think understanding the brain science can help integrate these different sources of information so they're more coherent. And you're less confused about why you're acting the way that you are, Mm-hmm. Think of a law firm partner, like the classic, having a huge outburst over some totally trivial detail that wasn't perfect, and throwing phones and staplers and all this stuff. And you're like, why as a profession does this keep happening?
Yeah.
And I think a lot of it is because people are not really operational in their own brains and bodies in a way that allows them to be like stable, happy individuals.
Mm-hmm. One of the other things that I think is super interesting about his work is one of these diagrams that he has of the river of integration. This is my favorite thing. I probably think about the river of integration multiple times a week, because what he kind of talks about is that mental health is like a river, and you have the left bank, which is your left brain, and the right bank, which is your right brain. Left brain logic, right brain emotion. And mental health is to like be in a canoe, like bopping down the river, floating in the middle. And when we get kind of in our extremes, when we get overly emotional or we get overly logical and rigid, which I think is what a lot of lawyers do, then we are struggling. We are not in a place of happy mental health. Where things get super kooky is when you start bouncing from bank to bank, and that is chaos. And I think we can all probably think of times in our lives when we've had that, where you're like hyper logical and then you're like crying, right. Or, and you're just kind of bouncing back and forth. And so your job is to kind of use tools and techniques to right the boat and get it back into the middle of the river. And I think that one of the things that I find so impressive about these diagrams or this terminology that he kind of incorporates and uses is, you can call it in yourself as you're thinking through what's going on with yourself, and it can really help you kind of anchor what's going on with yourself.
Yeah, I like the river of integration as well. I mean, one of the things he talks about too is that your goal is really to widen this window of tolerance, whether it's for negative feelings that you don't really want to process, so you've been repressing, or just, for general life, like to make yourself more resilient, more flexible, more adaptable, so that you can maintain equilibrium in the face of stressors that might have previously thrown you off kilter. And I think this is a good way of looking at it because, as you move through law school and your legal career, it's almost like the pressure just keeps getting ratcheted up. You might think law school, your first year is really bad, but then try being a 2L when you have all this other stuff going on, or try being a young lawyer. And I think it just kind of doesn't stop. So you've got to kind of throughout your life be broadening this window of tolerance so that you can function, kind of bopping down in the canoe between all this crazy stuff that's happening all around you.
Because all of a sudden one day you wake up and like you're in charge.
Yeah.
Or like you're the grown up in the room. I still feel that way sometimes. I remember I was like a couple of years ago, I had a neighbor who was out of town and her teenage kids were home alone, and something happened that freaked out the kids. And so, she sends this text and she's like, and, Lee's home, so you can go, like, just go over there if you need something. And I had this moment of like, why would she come over and get me?
And what am I going
to do? And then I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm like the grown up in the room. And I had this moment like, whoa, because I remember being a teenager and having my mom talk to my neighbors and be like, oh, someone, Lee's home alone if she needs something. And so I think you do have to constantly be stretching yourself, because you're going to end up having to be the lawyer that's in charge. You're going to have to sit with, if you work one-on-one with a client, and have hard discussions with them, help them make life-altering decisions, give them disappointing news and hold that for them, and without destroying yourself.
Yeah, and I think this is an interesting point of the legal profession, because a lot of people tend to be drawn to the profession because they kind of naturally favor this logical left brain approach to life. Let's be honest, a lot of people are probably trying to hide from unpleasant feelings.
Yep.
This goes back to Brene Brown talking about perfectionism. Lots of law students and lawyers are perfectionists. That's basically because they're trying to hide from feelings of inadequacy or not being good enough or whatever. And as she points out, the problem is you can't just dull the unpleasant stuff, because you end up dulling everything.
That's true.
And then that actually makes you less effective in a profession where you end up needing to actually communicate with people pretty frequently.
Yeah.
So it's kind of funny because law school, kind of selects for this left brain logical approach. But then I think when you get out in the profession, these other skills end up being super valuable. And, you really need them, even if you're just, you don't have client contact, but you're working in a team in a legal organization. You're going to be working with a lot of pretty crazy personalities who are not probably very integrated.
Yeah, they haven't been reading Mindsight in their free time.
Right, and one of the stories in his book is really a 92-year-old lawyer, which was kind of a crazy story.
I knew that a lawyer had to be in this book. When you start reading the first section, you're like, there's going to be a lawyer who needs help.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, because there are medical doctors in the book that need help too.
Right.
Yeah.
No, but this guy, 92 years old, his son brings him in for therapy, and, he's kind of like, I don't really know why I'm here.
Yep.
And he basically disconnected his whole life, from himself, from others. And part of this, was a result of his childhood about having cold, emotionless parents. I mean, let's be honest, working as a lawyer for many years probably didn't help. So he comes in at 92. I mean, imagine this. Basically says he has no feelings. His wife, I think, had been in the hospital. He did not have any reaction to it. They'd been married 60 plus years. And he was like, well, I just figured she'd get better.
Right.
Which is not really an average reaction to that type of thing.
Yeah.
But he said he wanted to experience feelings basically before he died. So it was pretty fascinating.
And I think one of the things that was so incredible about this story was that Dan Siegel, through therapy and tools and techniques he talks about in this book, was able to help this guy change his brain at 92.
Yeah, exactly. So, they were working on helping him get in touch with his interior world, learning to describe what he was experiencing directly. So the actual sensation, instead of narrating and explaining it, which is what he'd done his whole life as a lawyer, things like, well, what was breakfast like for you? Well, I ate cornflakes. That's kind of just to stick to the facts.
Right.
That's the kind of lawyer approach versus well, I heard the crunch of the cornflakes when I bit into them. I felt the crunchy, sticky sensation in my teeth. He had no access to any of that. And as he started to kind of access those pieces of his brain, he started to really understand things that he'd never understood before. So he understood his wife and her feelings and became a totally different person.
Yeah, they talked about how different it was to hug each other, or kiss each other, or rub each other's shoulders, that had just totally opened up this new part of himself that changed their relationship drastically in their 90s.
Yeah, it's crazy.
Crazy.
Yeah, because I remember, having similar discussions with my therapist in law school when I went
Luckily, you weren't 92.
Luckily, I was not 92, but I think it was really one of the best things I ever did because I was pretty similar, I went in and I just thought I don't know why I'm not getting out of bed. I seem to be, objectively speaking, I think I'm clinically depressed. Can you sort this out for me? I've really got to get back to going to class. I've got, did really well first semester. I need to make sure I'm on law review. Let's just get this sorted out. Whatever we need to do, let's make a plan, get to it. And so she would ask me questions well, I'd tell her some story about why I wasn't going to class or whatever. And she'd be like, well, how does that make you feel? And I would just sit there and say, well, I think this. She's like, that's not the question I'm asking you. And I'm like, yeah, I don't really understand your question. So I could totally relate to the story. I mean, luckily I didn't wait until I was 92.
Yeah.
But I knew exactly where he was coming from. The sensation of I don't even understand what you're asking me.
Yeah.
But the point is, when someone walks you through this or you start to use some of his techniques yourself, you can develop these new ways of, approaching the world and yourself because it's never too late for neuroplasticity.
No. And I was at a talk, the other talk I went to, because I'm an extra geek, an extra Dan Siegel geek. So when I went to the extra talk that he did when he was in town this spring, one of the interesting things that came up was a discussion around a research partner he had that had passed away a few years back. And it came up and, it was interesting because he was like, let's all just take a moment because it's really hard that she is gone. And it wasn't teary. It was just let's all just take a moment and feel in our hearts the fact that we are, that we have lost this person. And it was in a theater,
Right.
But one of the things that was kind of powerful about that, and I think this is something else that's lost a lot in the legal profession, is this acknowledgement of pain. How transformative is it? And I know there are people doing this work in the legal profession to be able to say, that is so awful. What would happen if we just sat and appreciated this awfulness before we move on, instead of just crushing down the emotions and pretending like they don't exist? So you're drinking at night because you have no other options.
Right. I mean, I think the Buddhists talk about this a lot. It's kind of one of the tenets of kind of Buddhist thinking is, you have to feel the emotion basically in order to deal with it. So yeah, I think, at least for me, being a young lawyer, a law student, you're just oh, I've got to just keep going, just work harder, do more, blah, blah, blah. Who cares what I think about whatever my feelings? I don't have time for this. What nonsense is this?
Exactly.
Who has time for this craziness? What is this relevant to anyway? But then you end up in these other places depression, anxiety, self-medicating, because they're going to come out one way or the other. So yeah, I think, anything in this sort of category, and I think he has a pretty specific model that he works with people and explains to them can be very helpful.
Yeah. So one of his models that he references a lot in this book and his other books is the wheel of awareness. And we will try and link to, I've seen it on his website. So because I've also stalked his website. I hope nobody sends him this. It's going to sound really creepy.
Like, wow, Lee is a super fan.
Sorry, Dan Siegel. But I found it on his website. So we'll link to it in the show notes. But basically what it is it's a wheel, so a circular wheel with a rim and spokes and a hub, the hub being in the center. And the rim is anything that you can pay attention to. So thoughts, feelings, perceptions of the outside world, bodily sensations. And the hub is your inner peace of mind from which we can become more aware. And the spokes represent how we can direct our attention to a particular part of the rim to notice something. And this idea can help people get a bit of space from their perceptions and also start to have the space to do something other than react instinctively. And so one of the things I think that's so powerful about this hub idea is this idea that if you are somewhere on the rim where you do not want to be,
right,
you can go back to your hub and then choose another spoke, I guess, to find another spot on the rim. And I think that if you can get to a point in your own mind where you feel like that you can do this, that you have the power to change how you feel about something, I think that that is a really transformational idea.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's a great visual because, you think like, oh, whatever's happening to me right now or whatever I'm noticing is happening to me more accurately right now is just the way it is. I mean, there's nothing I can do about that.
Right.
But when you think of it as a rim, you're like, there's actually a lot of others. Like, what if I just turned around? I'd have a totally different perception of the world. Like, what if I look up or down or, three-dimensional space? Like, I don't actually have to be paying attention to this thing that I'm fixated on right now. And I mean, obviously, if your arm is about to be cut off or something, like, there are things you need to pay attention to. But oftentimes, the things that the
anxious thoughts,
the things we notice and then the stories we make up about those things. So, maybe your professor said something to you that you feel like was insulting and now you're brooding about it for the rest of the day. Well, maybe they were just having a bad day. Maybe they didn't even mean it that way. Maybe you heard it differently because you were projecting all these other things from your childhood or whatever on it. And maybe it was just a thing that happened. And maybe they were being rude to you and maybe that did suck. But you can just take a step back from that and say, think about something else.
Yeah. Brene Brown's Netflix special tells a great story about her and her husband swimming across the lake.
I remember that from a book.
And it's also this idea of the stories that we tell ourselves and how we fill in these gaps, and that's a great story. You should watch that Netflix special for people listening. If you haven't gotten to watch it yet, it's a good hour, good study break. But I think, having something as tangible as this wheel of awareness, I think can be very powerful. And the work that I think it takes to make this productive is to develop your own hub, and that's really where you are able to go back and kind of find that center of yourself. He does this through, the idea of kind of mindfulness meditation to be able to kind of engage that hub and be able to feel what that feels like, to feel that place of kind of calm and control. I think you can find that place through many different avenues, but I think that idea of home base is really great. I can't remember if this was in the book or if it was in one of the other things or stories I've listened to about a preschooler or somebody was having a meltdown and ran up to their parent and was like, I can't find my hub. I can't find my hub.
I think he might have told that story in the panel.
Or something, yeah. Which I thought was amazing because, but I think what was so interesting about that story is even a child can say I'm trying to find this other part of myself.
Yeah, I think it was a child with his teacher. And
his teacher, that's right.
All these behavioral issues, and she taught her class about, and they were 5-year-olds or something, taught them about this idea of the wheel of awareness. And yeah, usually, he would spiral out of control. And then it got to the point where he would realize what was happening and take a step back and realize okay, I need to reach out for help because I'm about to go totally out of control. And then she can work with that. Yeah.
I think that's the thing when you read about children. And I think we're going to talk about a couple of the other case studies in here that we thought were interesting. One is about a child. But, they don't filter as much as adults do, so I think it's always fascinating to listen to children describe what's happening with themselves, sometimes even my son will say I'm having a really hard time. It's he has enough awareness to know that he's bouncing back from the rivers across the sides of the river of integration. and he can't necessarily find his way out, but there's like a self, there's a recognition, like I'm out of control. And I think as adults, we're so often told that we shouldn't admit that, and then we make terrible mistakes.
Right. And people, are particularly in the legal profession, sometimes kind of allowed to get away with this stuff.
Yeah.
You think of partners blowing up and doing, having huge yelling matches and
sending
throwing
aggressive
things
emails.
All these things where if they took a step back, they might think, you know what, this is probably not great for me. It's probably not great for the other people in this room. It's probably not great for our relationships.
Yep.
Because this is one of the things I found interesting about the book is that, a lot of this ends up being too about your interpersonal reactions because you're mirroring people around you. We have literal mirror neurons that enable us to kind of understand what other people are thinking or feeling. So that's how you pick up on emotional states. So, if you're an out of control like boss and you're wondering why everyone's quitting and that's ruining your life and like probably costing you money, maybe taking a step back and not throwing the stapler and keeping that associate might be a better choice.
Yeah. In his more recent research, he's calling it MUI. Remember the MUI?
Oh, the MUI, like
me and
we.
Me and we. There's no me without we.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Total
geek. So there were a couple. So in this book, there are a number of case studies. There was a 92-year-old lawyer, which I thought was fascinating. But the one that really stuck with me too was about this young adolescent who was dealing with OCD. And one of the things that really struck me about this story, I was listening to it on audiobook, so I was driving by myself and I had nobody to talk to about it. So I was like, when are you going to read that part of the book so I can talk to you about it?
Yeah, it was at the very end.
It was at the very end. But one of the things that I found so powerful about this story was this idea that she was able to be taught to how to kind of regulate her emotional state using some different techniques of dialoguing even with her own mind. And I think so often we feel powerless over our own mind. We are anxious and there's nothing I can do about it.
That's just the way it is. That's who I am. I'm an anxious person.
Right. And, there's nothing I can do about that. And I found that some of the techniques that he was working with her about like naming the part of her brain. I can't remember what the part is that creates the OCD.
I think it's like the whatever. Yeah.
So it's a very primitive, it's a primitive part of our brain that's part of our like fight and flight.
Yeah, it's kind of like the brainstem, like, subconscious. It's the thing that makes you like jump before you know why you're jumping.
Right. So if that is overactive, that's part of what can link to kind of OCD type behaviors. And so she like names this part of her brain, she talks to it, and they talk a lot about how she dialogues with herself. And I found this something that we never talk about. I think especially as women who can be really self-critical.
Right.
But, he was like, why would you ever, have an aggressive argument with yourself because you will always lose.
You're never going to win the argument. You're never going to
win the argument with yourself. Why would you not be kind to yourself? Because, you're never going to feel better after, not being kind. And so, she would like thank that part of her brain. So she had this whole kind of dialogue when she would feel these reactions coming up, and she would say like, I think she named it Sam, right? And she would say, Sam, thank you for trying to keep me safe, but I am safe and I do not need your help.
Right.
Or something along those lines.
And so that's very different from someone who just decides that like, well, I'm just going to repress these unpleasant feelings and pretend that I don't have them, or argue with myself about like, well, you're so stupid. Like, why are you doing these stupid things? You should just stop doing them.
Right. Why is this part of my brain? There's something wrong with me. Where she was basically saying like, this is just part of me and I can manage this part of me. And I thought that was just such a powerful message, especially from a teenager, which is pretty unbelievable. And they were able to help her move through her OCD and into young adulthood without medication, which I think is pretty incredible because it was pretty severe.
Yeah, exactly. When she came to him, it was pretty crazy.
Yeah.
And it seems like it definitely worked. Yeah, I mean, there have been similar conversations with like people on our team whose children are ADHD, and part of what this parent said is like, I just want him to understand how his brain works and understand that it works differently,
right?
And that's okay,
right?
But if you don't understand that, then how are you going to solve the practical problems that come up because of the way this brain is working? And
I think that we see a lot of folks who are diagnosed with things like ADHD in law school. And I think that's a similar concern is even, as adults, you might be told, well, your brain works differently, but then where's the follow-up?
Right. Like, what do you do about that?
What do you do about that? Because I often will people will be like, well, I'm in therapy for that. I'm like, great. What are the coping mechanisms you're going to use to help with that part of your brain? Right. And I think that there used to be this, the dialogue of like, well, you're just anxious. Well, It's like, okay, but I don't think
like, how are you going to scaffold that?
Right.
It's like, you don't, if you're building a house or something, you've got to have that scaffolding in place so that you can do what needs to be done. It's the same thing with any sort of challenge here. Like, we all have things we're better or worse at. Mm-hmm. And it's a question of like, what are the tools that you can use to kind of accommodate or help you accommodate this, whether that is some sort of mindfulness technique or brain technique or some sort of strategy or even just a practical thing, If you feel like you are not a person who is inherently that organized, well, are you going to use something like Trello or, to help yourself get more organized and make it easy for yourself? So, it's just really, I think, a question of taking a step back and evaluating, like, where are my weak points and what can I do to scaffold that so that it doesn't become a huge issue for me?
Yeah. The other thing that I think is interesting about his work is, oftentimes he does go back into people's childhoods and really talks about, how your family unit dealt with things. And then fascinating things would come out in some of these case studies. It'd be like,
by the way, like, yes, my brother died and we never talked about it.
Right. And I remember I was on a walk, like, reading that and I was like, what?
Yeah, like, oh yeah, totally an eventful childhood. Parents were fine, everything was fine. And then suddenly it's like, oh yeah, well, there was the thing about the leukemia.
And that's like this horrible loss that, I'd never dealt with and was never like shepherded through by my parents. And I think that, there is kind of unique opportunities if you think that you learned maybe some negative habits around these kinds of things through your childhood, that you can fix this stuff.
Well, I think that was a great point too, where he doesn't approach it as like, oh, there's a problem with you.
Right.
He describes it as more like, this is what your childhood brain did to survive. Mm-hmm. And that was adaptive in that situation. If you've just had this horrible loss and no one in your family is willing to acknowledge it, then yeah, of course you're going to suppress like your feelings of sadness because you're a child and you need to survive.
Yeah.
But maybe that's not serving you when you're a grown up and, your relationships are falling apart and you feel distant from your own children and all these things. But there are things that you can do that really actually aren't that complicated.
Yeah, I think he really approaches everyone's mental health as this idea that, everyone's a work in progress. And he tells a lot of stories about his own missteps as a parent. And, he talks about, feeling like he was going to drop out of medical school and like a lot of different kind of points in his life where he still struggles with this stuff. And one of the things that I think I appreciate about his research and about this book is there's no idea of perfection here. It's that everyone's on a journey and we're just trying to like get ourselves to be our best selves.
Right. Just get in the middle of that stream.
Just get in the middle of the stream.
Even if you're surfing the rapids.
Yes. So, and I think one of the things that we know lawyers struggle with are interpersonal relationships. We know marriages.
There's good data on this.
There's good data on this. Marriages typically can fall apart with lawyers. And so if you, don't know a lot about your own state and how to control your own emotions and be able to connect with people, like, this is something you want to work on because it's like a whole person thing. It's not like, it's either to make you a better lawyer, but it's also probably going to make you a better whole person, whatever your outside life is.
Yeah. And I think too, like having the ability to take a step back from your reactions is going to enable you to make better career choices and things like that. Mm-hmm. And these kind of big picture stuff, you've kind of got to figure it out.
Yeah. Well, any other final thoughts?
No, go get the book. It's interesting.
I know. It is super interesting. And if you're a parent, I do recommend his books on children and parenting because I think they're also very interesting. But I feel like I've read enough of them now. I could probably stop till he writes something else new.
Well, he does seem pretty prolific.
He is very prolific.
In fact, he was Chelsea Handler's therapist for her new book about going into therapy.
That's true, which is Life Will Be the Death of Me, which we were just talking about is one of the next things I will read.
Yeah, so you could start there too.
Yeah. So with that, unfortunately, we are out of time. If you enjoyed this episode of the Law School Toolbox podcast, please take a second to leave a review and rating on your favorite listening app. We'd really appreciate it. And be sure to subscribe so you don't miss anything. If you have any questions or comments, please don't hesitate to reach out to myself or Alison at lee@lawschooltoolbox.com or allison@lawschooltoolbox.com, or you can always contact us via our website contact form at lawschooltoolbox.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk soon.